We are kicking things off with two guests from the federal government, giving us a broad overview of disability policy and what the federal government is doing. We are glad to welcome back Dr. Sachin Pavithran, the Executive Director of the United States AccessBoard, as well as Ann Sommers McIntosh, the Executive Director of the National Council on Disability. Sachin and Ann, welcome to the ACB Legislative Seminar.
Great to be here.
Thanks for having me.
And Swatha, I'll let you take it away from here.
Absolutely. So I just want to get to know you both better. So can you tell, or Ann first, can you tell us about what the NCD does or what its role is in the federal government?
Absolutely. I was unfamiliar. We have been in the federal government now for 38 years, and we began as a very small, actually we were in the federal government longer than 38 years. We started as a little advisory body in the Department of Education. And we only gave advice about education of students with disabilities. But in 1984, we became fully independent. And so since that time, we've had the ability to tackle a broad range of topics. So anything cradle to grave, anything under the sun, and all disabilities. So we advise the president, the US Congress, and other federal agencies, as well as state policymakers, on matters that affect people with disabilities. We have a very broad mission statement, which is wonderful and awful at the same time, because we always have to make hard decisions on what to focus on in any given year. But we have been able to make very high impact with our small resources and staff. We're most, I guess, well-known and famous for being the authors and the original suggestors, I guess would be a good way of putting it. We advised Congress to create an Americans with Disabilities Act, and then we drafted the first version that went up before the Hill for consideration. And so that's our history is inextricably tied with the ADA, and we benchmark all that we do against the four goals of the ADA. And we are comprised of 5 presidential appointees and 4 congressional appointees, and a very small staff of 11 professional staff in the greater DC area.
Absolutely. Same for you, Sachin. What does the AccessBoard do, and what is its role in the government?
Thank you, Swatha. And I'm glad to join all of you today, and thanks for inviting me back. So the US AccessBoard, we've been in existence for close to 50 years now. So in 1968, the Architectural Barriers Act is the piece of legislation that brought the AccessBoard into existence. That's not the legislation that started the AccessBoard. That is the piece of legislation that's opened the pathway for the AccessBoard to come into existence. The Architectural Barriers Act being the legislation that defines accessibility for federal spaces, on what the standards needs to be for federal spaces. So in 1973, the Rehab Act is what brought AccessBoard into existence as a federal agency. We are a small federal agency of about 30 staff and 25 board members. 13 of the 25 board members are appointed by the president from the public from around the country, and the remainder 12 are heads of 12 different agencies, such as Department of Justice, Transportation, Commerce, GSA, Interior. So 12 different agencies, senior level political appointees serve on our board. So 25 governing members of the board. The role of the US AccessBoard is to define accessibility. Accessibility is our bread and butter. We work on anything and everything to do with accessibility, whether it's built environment, digital accessibility, medical diagnostic equipment, whatever it might be. When there's accessibility, conversation needs to happen that we are the agency that set the standards and guidance to what that should look like. We work closely with all federal agencies on these different regulations that the Access Board puts out. We don't enforce all the standards and regulations we put out there. The only standard and the only regulation that the Access Board enforces is the Architecture Barriers Act, the ABA. That is the one regulation that we have authority in enforcing. So if anyone finds accessibility barrier in the federal space, we have a mechanism to receive the complaint and then work with the federal entity to remove that barrier. The rest of the regulations we work for, even though we set the standards, other agencies are the ones that enforce them if they adopt and are legislated to enforce them. We don't have any authority in enforcing. That's often a confusion that exists because we do write standards for a lot of different regulations out there, but we don't have the authority to enforce those regulations. So I'll give you an example. Section 508, which a lot of us are familiar with, the U.S. Access Board wrote Section 508, and the standards are out there for federal agencies to utilize, but we do not enforce them. In fact, Section 508 is a unique kind of regulation where all federal agencies are self-enforcing. So it's probably not the best scenario because self-enforcing goes only so far. So that is our role. We are a regulatory agency working on different standards and guidance on all the various accessibility issues that's out there. We do enforce the ABA, and we try to be a player in the accessibility space, both within the public sector and the private sector.
Okay, great. So can you both talk about your roles at NCD and the Access Board? We'll start with Sachin first.
So I'm the executive director of the Access Board. So my role is to oversee the overall mission of the Access Board. Now, the governing board members gives us the direction on what needs to be the priorities for the Access Board. When we work on different rule makings, the different rules that we are working on, the board is the one that sets our priorities. They also set our strategic plan for the next 4 years that every federal agency is supposed to put forward. As the executive director, my role is to work with the staff to ensure the priorities set by the members of the board is executed, and also do the day-to-day activities to ensure the smooth running of the agency.
Great, and Ann, any other?
Yeah, very similarly, I'm also the executive director of our agency, so very similar to the Access Board, our council does set the policy priorities. The staff has degrees of discretion within the four corners of the priorities that are set by the council. And again, very similar to the Access Board, I am ultimately responsible for working with our team directors on the staffing, the operations, the financial and policy development pieces. And one other thing I would add is something that's unique about NCD is because we are fully independent and we're purely advisory, we do have a huge degree of flexibility in determining what the policy agenda will be for the council. And I would say that it's equal parts push and pull. So what I mean by that is the council will set an agenda of things we would like policymakers to care about, and they may not care about them. And we try to make a compelling argument for why they should and what our solutions are to the problems that we like to raise to their attention. And then we also have a fair amount of technical assistance and response that we give to outreach that we receive from policymakers who are looking for NCD's expertise and policy solutions for problems that they identify as priorities. So it's kind of both in equal measure, I'd say.
And so if I could add real quick, Ann brought up an important point. One of the biggest difference between the AccessBoard and the NCD is we don't have that liberty to kind of set our priorities unless Congress gives us the authority. So when we work on regulations, it needs to be in legislation, and we need to be granted that authority through Congress before we can take up working on any particular standards.
Mm-hmm. You see a lot in like legislation or bills like the AccessBoard should like do this or do this, and so it's kind of now we all know about like you have to do that if we want to be any power at all. So interesting. And just to follow up with your last year and the year before we had Andres Gallegos, the chair of NCD. So how does your role differ from his, and how do you how the differ?
Oh, I am the lowercase b boss, BOSS. He is the capital B boss, capital B BOSS. He was designated by the president on the first day of the Biden administration last year as the chairman of the council. So his role, he was appointed by Senator Chuck Schumer, the majority leader, and he was designated by the president as its chairman. So he really is the captain of the ship. He steers things, and he's ultimately responsible for the direction and of the council. And I work at his behest. So thus the lowercase b little boss of the staff. So his role is all of our council members serve no more than 2 3-year terms. So he is in his second year of his, I don't want to misspeak, his second year of his second term. So he has this year and next year, and then he will wrap up his time, and someone will presumably be appointed behind him. So all of our council members are on set periods of time for service, whereas the staff generally have a longevity to them as civilian employees. So that's one of the major distinctions as well.
All right, back to you, Clark.
All right. Great. Thank you so much, Swatha. And folks, I'm going to run through some moderated questions here with our guests, Sachin and Ann. Again, as Dan said earlier, if you have questions that you would like to be asked towards the end of this session, please email questions with an S at the end, 2 S's total, questions@acb.org. or call or text Janet Dickelman at 651-428-5059. So Sachin and Ann, you both talked about the priorities and areas of focus for the AccessBoard and National Council on Disabilities. I know a big one for both of you is accessible health and wellness. And it just so happens that that's a big priority for ACB as well. Towards the end of 2020 and throughout 2021, we've been focusing on our Get Up and Get Moving campaign. And that is a multi-year effort that focuses on advocacy, partnerships, and public awareness to improve the health and wellness and access for our members and the broader community. This also touches on 2 of our legislative imperatives this year, the Exercise and Fitness for All Act, as well as the Medical Device Non-Visual Accessibility Act. So both of these bills were introduced in 2021, one focusing on the need to create accessibility standards for fitness and exercise equipment for people with disabilities, including people who are blind and low vision, and the other focusing on non-visual access to durable medical equipment and medical diagnostic devices. So Sachin, I'll turn to you first. How is the AccessBoard working to increase accessibility in terms of health and wellness.
Thanks, Clark. Obviously, this is a very important topic for me personally, as well as a blind person myself. I'm very well aware about the lack of accessibility that exists when it comes to fitness equipment and also medical diagnostic equipment. So when it comes to the fitness equipment, I know there's been a bill introduced where the AccessBoard is indicated to write those standards. Unfortunately, our role does not start till that bill is put into law. Our role right now is working with some of the entities that are working on some of those standards apart from the federal government. So we have staff that are working with some entities and also industry in being part of the conversation of accessibility. We just don't have the authority to actually regulate, put them into standards that would be something that industry has to follow. Till the legislation becomes law, we don't have the authority to do that. But that doesn't mean that we don't work on those on the sidelines with, like I said, in the private sector and other organizations that are working on these kind of standards. Similar to the medical similar to the fitness one, the medical diagnostic equipment as well. The AccessBoard does have a standard on a limited medical diagnostic equipment standard that was passed under the ACA that we have within patient care. It does not address the accessibility of all the equipment that we would use in a home base. So the work that we've done so far that we've been given authority is very limited, but we are having conversations with FDA on some of the other additional accessibility that needs to be addressed. We've also been working with HHS on some of the accessibility barriers that exist. But again, like I said, we don't have the authority to really write the standards till it's been given, till we've been granted the authority.
Thank you, Sachin. Oh, and yes, Ann.
And I'll jump in and say that's right. You mentioned our chairman, Andres Gallegos, and he, on his first day, he let everybody know, he put his flag down and he said, my tenure is going to be about health equity for people with disabilities. And we're going to be pushing the peanut as much as we can through my remaining time on the council on health equity. So we've been laser focused on that. And in very recent days, some of you may be familiar with our health equity framework, which we just released a couple of weeks ago. It is a living document. In the framework itself, we have 4 foundational planks that we have spelled out as seen that we view, and the folks that we've been working with on the framework had viewed as foundational to establishing the health equity for people with disabilities, but certainly not comprehensive in its scope. One of those was the AMDE, the Accessible Medical and Diagnostic Equipment. We've been really focused on getting the standards that exist, that the AccessBoard has done such a great job on, memorialized by DOJ and HHS OCR so that they can become enforceable. And as Sachin just mentioned, they are not as expansive as they could be, the existing standards. And so, would really invite ACB's review of our health equity framework to the extent that we can expand upon it. One of the things we messaged on it right away, and it's available on NCD's website on our homepage and also under healthcare on our categories tab on the far left. If you navigate the homepage, we have the AMDE in particular really has that physical and mobility focus, mobility disability focus. And as Sachin referenced, we've been really focused on the facilities where people go to get treatment rather than in-home use of equipment. But harkening back to the distinction that we made between AccessBoard and NCD, we can absolutely call for things that are not, right? So the bills that you're referencing, we have a pretty long history of actually reviewing bills that have been introduced, and when we think that they are absolutely consistent with what we're recommending on a principles level, we actually will go so far as to recommend specific bills to Congress. So would love to hear more about the bills that you're referencing and see if we have committed to looking at regular intervals to our health equity framework to expand upon it. And this won't surprise any of you. We were incredibly gun shy in publicly unveiling the health equity framework because we were sure we had forgotten things. And the day that we unveiled it, we heard from just scores and scores of people, by and large, very, very effusively praising the framework and excited about it. But invariably, we had forgotten and overlooked things. And so immediately, folks, we like that. What's the hallmark of a good advocate? They're loud, right? So squeaky wheel us, let us hear from you specifically about our health equity framework, and some of the bills that were just referenced sound perfect for inclusion in our refresh in the next time that we open it up to make some additions. We've got a laundry list already started, so we'd love to set up a meeting with all of you and hear more about how we can be a little bit even more inclusive than what we were trying to do right out of the gate. But that health equity framework is one that I point folks to. We did a wholesale report on accessible medical and diagnostic equipment last May. But again, it was very much focused. We had had a pretty discouraging meeting with the Department of Justice in 2020, where we encouraged them to go ahead and accept the AccessBoard standards. And at the time, they issued kind of a challenge back to us and said, we just don't know if we have enough information to act. And we took it as a challenge, and we wrote a whole report on it. And you'll see if you read that report that even in the transmittal letter, we essentially said to the president in the transmittal letter, we wrote this for your Department of Justice, who told us they didn't have enough information to act. And so here you go. Here's a 150-page report that lays the case for why DOJ needs to act. So we were really heartened to see both DOJ and HHS OCR indicate in the unified agenda their intent to pursue rulemaking inclusive of the standards that AccessBoard has worked so hard on. So we're very excited about that. We do have two items in the health equity framework that specifically speak to some of the legislative priorities in principle that you're referencing. One is we call specifically for Medicare coverage of low vision devices. So we don't cap that in any particular manner, but we say that that's absolutely essential for health equity. And another one we have that strikes me as one that we might need to tweak with your help is we call for mandating that municipal park districts and hospitals that receive federal financial assistance, that they have to provide fitness facilities that are inclusive of commercial grade strength and cardio equipment that can be used independently by people who are blind and low vision. And we're calling on DOJ and HHS to take a leadership role in those respects. So those are just two quick highlights that I could mention, Clark.
And thank you so much for highlighting those items within the health equity framework. Certainly low vision coverage is something that ACB and our members have been advocating for quite some time. And we look forward to working with you on those items, as well as ensuring the non-visual access for durable and diagnostic equipment. So thank you. One more item related to healthcare before I turn it over to Swatha here, and that is dealing with telehealth and telemedicine. So is there anything that either NCD or that the AccessBoard is doing to ensure accessibility in telehealth services?
I can jump in there first. This is Ann. One of the things that we've been engaging, we've had a lot of conversations within the four corners of our health equity framework, and then also outside of the four corners, just generally speaking on health equity in principle with a lot of our federal colleagues. We have the great fortune right now, I mentioned pushing and pulling at NCD, because in the very early days of the Biden administration, President Biden issued the equity EO, which was very, very helpful. He set the tone very early in the administration that he had an expectation of all of his cabinet level agencies to do everything they could in their power to look at rulemakings and guidance and anything and everything that was within their power to advance equity for underserved communities, and specifically identified people with disabilities among the groups mentioned as an underserved community. For that reason, we've been reaching out on our health equity framework across offices and divisions within HHS, and have had, very much a receptive audience in terms of interest in the things that we're raising. I think due in large part because of the equity EO. So that I think there's a confluence of political will and direction set early in the administration by the president that's really helping in terms of willingness to engage. And on the telehealth side, one of the things we heard very early when we started working on our health equity framework in its developmental stage, we heard from the sensory disability communities, plural, about the inaccessibility of telehealth, generally speaking, for so many people, as well as electronic health record platforms, both of those being heavily emphasized during the pandemic, and both of them being extraordinarily problematic for blind and deaf communities for different reasons. And so I'll share too, we did a Hill briefing on our health equity framework just a couple weeks ago and had a really good uptake from the committees of jurisdiction. And one of the staff members who's low vision, immediately following, asked the question during our Q&A. She said, I know this, I'm making this about me, but I can't access my electronic health records, and telehealth platforms are incredibly difficult for me to use. What's NCD saying about that? So we have heard that loud and clear from the beginning of our work on the health equity framework, and we're raising the profile of those issues everywhere we can. One of the places that we sit too is there are a lot of tables that have been convened in this administration. Sachin and I both join a number of interagency work groups that are tied to disability. And a number of them have been looking at and talking through the equity executive order and what they can do. And we've been, a lot of times behind the scenes, we've been trying to raise the profile on some of these issues. So within our health equity framework, we're certainly pushing on it. And we're hopeful that in light of telehealth being kind of here to stay and having an outsized role during the pandemic, we're really looking at insisting that something be done sooner rather than later, so that the access problems that have been prevalent and extensive throughout the pandemic can be finally addressed. And I should mention too, Clark, we did a progress report, which is our one statutorily required report a year that we send to Congress. We do a lot of discretionary reports, but that's the one that we have to do every year. Last year's report we made about the impact of the pandemic on people with disabilities, and in that progress report, we also highlighted the access issues with telehealth. So we've been trying in a number of ways to raise the profile in Hill briefings and in our conversations with policymakers as we advise.
Just to add real quick, we haven't had any direct role in the telehealth space other than working with entities, especially working with the HHS in really pushing the conversation on accessible platforms in the healthcare space. So that's been a conversation an ongoing conversation we've been having. We haven't worked on any particular standards or regulation on it, but we are engaging other federal agencies that have, even a DOJ, that it comes to what needs to be a priority when it comes to accessibility for accessing medical information or accessing a physician in a more accessible platform.
Yeah, I'm glad that Clark brought telehealth because my next question has to do with web accessibility. You guys mentioned the work you do in making telehealth accessible. So could you both speak to the work you're doing in web access more broadly, like in web and application access more broadly? Yeah.
So one thing, this is Sachin again with the AccessBoard. So one area, obviously, the AccessBoard has been involved, which I mentioned earlier, is Section 508. We put out our refresh in 2017, and we continue to work with agencies to really ensure web accessibility and digital accessibility is a high priority with the federal government. We work closely with GSA on this topic. Now, Ann mentioned about the executive orders on equity. So that's a conversation that has raised the awareness of digital accessibility within the federal government, and we've been playing a pretty significant role to ensure that becomes a priority, not just because Section 508 has been in existence for a while, but elevating the importance of digital accessibility more than it has in the past within federal space, not just internal accessibility for employees, but also external public-facing accessibility. In the federal government, it's slow moving, and unfortunately, accessibility does not always get to the forefront of the big main conversations in leadership. There has been a shift under the current administration, and it's promising to see the spotlight accessibility has been receiving, especially around digital accessibility.
And this is Ann. I would say in 2019, that progress report that I mentioned, that annual report we have to do every year. In 2019, we took a tact in 2018 and 2019 where we looked at, has the promise been kept, was kind of the framing that we used for those two reports. And we basically said, no, it hasn't in any number of ways. And we looked at federal enforcement of disability rights laws. And in the 2019 report, one of the big recommendations we made was for DOJ to move forward without any more delay on web access standards. And what we've been doing since that time is trying to ensure too, we know that in several budgets, we follow the budget cycle, the president's budget, and then obviously what happens in Congress is usually fairly divorced from the president's budget. And one of the things that we like to look at the staff level is what the funding levels are for various agencies that have enforcement authority or are being called on by us to take certain actions. And one of the things that we've noticed is in several recent years, DOJ's disability rights section within the Civil Rights Division has not gotten quite the investment that some of the other divisions have gotten. And so one of the things that we're looking at now is how can we have some conversations on the Hill to sensitize some of the appropriators and other folks as their advisors that we really need to ensure that there's adequate resource at DOJ in the disability rights section so that they can pursue a robust rulemaking agenda. And so we're hopeful that the web access regs may be something that are, queued up yet for attention and get over the finish line in this administration. And we're trying to do whatever we can on the back end to kind of shore that up. We also, early in the pandemic, we reached out to the National Conference on State Legislatures. And if you're not familiar, there's kind of two state government associations that NCD likes to liaise with pretty regularly on federal matters that play out at the state level. So that's why we liaise with them. The National Conference on State Legislatures is actually if you've ever been to their national conference, it's probably about 5,000 to 7,000 to 8,000 people pre-pandemic. It's they get convention centers and they completely pack them. And they're legislators from around the country, from state houses, and they show up and they organize their agendas and their sessions based on their committees of jurisdiction, and they tackle the different topics. And one of the things that we liaised with them very early on in the pandemic, and we're able to do some blog posts with them and some podcasts with them, was about as your states are pushing out and localities are pushing out information on vaccine access and treatment access and masking and safety and all of these things, are your websites accessible or are they not? And we found in a lot of instances, nobody, we tend to never find anyone who's like out to create an inaccessible website, right? It's people who are just moving too fast and not thinking through their obligations and not thinking through accessibility in a way they should. So they were, very eager to get resources and be made aware of community partners that they could reach out to, et cetera. But those are kinds of some of the things that we've been working on just in the recent term on the web access front.
Thank you. And at ACB, along with our partners, the American Foundation for the Blind, National Federation of the Blind, and National Disability Rights Network, just led a sign-on letter of more than 180 national and regional organizations urging the Department of Justice to finalize web access regulations within the current Biden administration. So we certainly share your enthusiasm for those web access standards to be finalized.
May it be so.
Yes. And actually, Swatha, since a lot of the conversation is focused on the equity executive order, do you have a follow-up question related to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I just wanted to ask if you both could speak to the implementation and the progress of the DEI and executive order that was put out last year by President Biden.
I can take a stab at it first. This is Sachin. So the DEIA Executive Order 14035 that got introduced in June, initially when the conversation started, so there was a diversity, equity, inclusion executive order that came out right when the administration started, which was more outward facing. And then the conversation started within the administration on having a similar executive order for within the federal government for all federal agencies to follow. When that conversation started, one of the biggest pieces that many of us who were involved in the drafting of the executive order pointed out to the administration was the lack of accessibility being more prominent in the executive order. The initial draft really did not have. So the initial draft was just going to be DEI. And we wanted to make sure accessibility was elevated to the top as well, because accessibility often becomes just another bullet point when it comes to the conversation of inclusion or equity, but it's not the same. It needs to have its own prominent showcasing of why it is important to have accessibility. So that's why the DEIA executive order was slightly different from the initial one that came out for the outward facing. If you've seen the executive order, the U.S. AccessBoard is specifically called out in the executive order for working with federal agencies on accessibility of built environment. We also been asked to work when it comes to digital accessibility as well. So we've been heavily involved in a lot of conversation when it comes to what the federal government at large needs to do when it comes to accessibility. One of the biggest barriers the federal government that has when it comes to accessibility is a lot of this, especially the digital accessibility, it's been self-evaluation. It's been self-monitoring of the accessibility there. Some agencies do better than others, but even within those larger agencies, there is definitely a shortfall in which sections of those agencies actually really do accessibility as well. So kind of elevating the importance of how these accessibility needs to be laid out. And one of the pieces that I've been pushing for strongly for the big departments is to have the CIOs for these departments to be invested in the conversation around accessibility, because if you don't have the buy-in of the CIOs of these big agencies, it's not going to go anywhere. So one of the roles that we've been playing is to really elevate and make it a requirement for CIOs to prioritize accessibility in every, whether it's budgetary request that they put forward, or whether it is other priorities in how they write policies within their departments when it comes to IT-related items. So, like I said earlier, it's frustrating because it takes time, but it is promising because there's been more momentum happening in the last year on this topic than I've seen historically before. I hope this is a good sign in what accessibility content will look like coming out of the federal government. Being the largest employer in the country, we need to set the example on what employers should be doing when it comes to accessible content, not just digital accessibility, but also physical accessibility as well, because we do have a lot of barriers when it comes to physical barriers as well. The one thing I would ask for all of you as advocates is to continue to push federal agency and put those red flags out there when there are outward-facing content for federal content that's out there if it's not accessible. But also, if you have members and other blind individuals or people with disabilities that you know that work in the federal government, try to get that information, try to get them to advocate within their federal agencies about the importance of accessibility, because it is going to take all of us to make this continue to move forward. Even though this administration has made it a high priority, we all know administrations come and go. We want this to stay on, not just for this administration, but also after, even for future administrations.
Right, and
go ahead, Ann.
I can't add much to what Sachin said, other than, we're very heartened by the leadership that AccessBoard's been playing. They're obviously recognized as the technical experts, and we're all really fortunate that they've been playing the large role that they have. I echo what Sachin was saying about getting the buy-in of the CIOs in the federal agencies, and think it's absolutely essential that the budget requests do reflect these things as priorities, because that's what happens when agencies put forward their budget requests. It's a little bit of sausage making here, but when we put forward our congressional justifications and we put forward our requests each year, we write narratives as agencies about basically the things that are important that we need money for, right? And so again, things get money when they're important, right? So if accessibility can become part of that narrative as like a critical piece, and that's consistent with the EO, I agree with Sachin. We have a real chance of getting the roots low enough, in the ground, that no matter what happens in future elections or future administrations, that we don't see, we have enough of the roots, tapping down low enough that we can hold on to some of these good things that are happening. And the only other thing I'd add as something of encouragement is, I can't remember, and I've been in government 13 years, federal government, I can't remember a time where there's been a greater frequency of calls about an EO. I don't know if Sachin would agree with that, but these calls are happening all the time, and they're very well attended. So it's not like they're sending the interns; they're sending high-level people to them. There's a number of resources that have been developed for agencies And so there is a lot of really encouraging momentum right now. And just would also echo what Sachin already said, that if folks are aware of blind and low vision employees within agencies that can raise some of these, raise the profile of some of these things, oftentimes an agency will make decisions on a person by person basis because they want to invest in their employees, but it has ripple effects, across other decisions that are made. So asking questions and referencing the EO, this is the time to do it. It would be very impactful. So just again, agreeing with everything Sachin had to say.
And I just want to add one thing real quick, Clark. What Ann said, the frequency of the conversation right now on this topic is really high, which is why it's important for as advocates to really push to make sure that if a department is not really working on the accessibility front as much, we need to really engage with those departments if no federal employees that are not seeing a shift in accessibility. Because like I said earlier, some departments, there's probably subsets of those departments doing good work, but the rest of the department might not be even bothering with the accessibility piece.
That's a good reminder for folks as well. And I know we're coming up on the end of our time here. So I quickly want to turn to Janet to see if we have received any questions from our listeners, because I could keep talking and asking you all questions all day. But unfortunately, we have some constraints that we're trying to work within. So Janet, do we have any questions?
We do have some questions, and what I'll do, the ones that we don't get to, I will forward on, for those of you listening, I'll forward them on to Clark and Swatha so that they can get back to you with the answers. I had someone who wanted to know what part of the ADA covers the internet and web accessibility. Is there a part, and
Sure. So I'm happy to answer that question, and probably more fully offline. But whether it's a good or service offered by the government, it can be covered under Title II of the ADA. Whether it's a good or service offered by places of public accommodations, it can be covered under Title III of the ADA. And if there are goods or services offered by employers on the internet, however, the services are inaccessible, it could be covered under the interference language of Title V of the ADA. So even though the ADA was written in 1990, I think there are many aspects of the ADA that apply to website and online accessibility.
All right. Then do you want to take a couple more? Or? Sure.
How about one more?
All right. I have a woman who, and I think this is just a matter of concern for her. She uses it sounds like a large screen glucometer, and she's concerned that we're talking about that glucose readers need to have talking features, and she's concerned that Medicare won't cover her large screen glucometer, but I'm sure if you want to speak about that.
Yes. Thank you, Janet. And that's something that I'll answer that by saying, stay tuned for our next session, which will be an overview of our legislative imperatives, which includes the Medical Device Non-Visual Accessibility Act. So we can certainly get to that question there. Sachin and Ann, thank you so much for joining us here. If folks want to learn more about the AccessBoard and stay up to date on the work that you're doing, Sachin, what's the best way for them to do that?
So our website, which is access-board.gov, is a wealth of information. We also have ongoing webinars on whether the accessibility of the built environment or the digital accessibility, which is monthly. But we also archive all our previous webinars that we've done on these different topic areas. So there's a lot of information that's available on our website when it comes to anything to do with accessibility.
And Ann, a similar question to you. What's the best way to stay up to date and learn more about the National Council on Disability?
Our website is no dashes, NCD, NancyCatDog.gov. And we like the AccessBoard's new website so well that we are going to copy it. We're in the middle of a website redo. And I mention that only because once we unveil our new website in July of this year, we will also be resurrecting our long forgotten listserv, and you will be able to sign up for emails from NCD as well on our website. We currently are not doing any, but we will be again in July.
That's great. Well, again, Ann Sommers McIntosh and Dr. Sachin Pavithran, thank you both for your time here today and helping us kick off the 2022 ACB Legislative Seminar.
Yeah, thank you both for your time today.
My honor. Thank you.